If you want to know the secrets of existence and the true meaning of life, I can't help you. But if you want some book recommendations, why not try reading the ones I wrote? If you're a fan of giant monster mayhem and anime weirdness, why not try Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1? If horror is more your style, you can't go wrong with The Occult Mafia. Those who enjoy their fantasy with a dark twist may be interested in Emerald of Maddox City. And if you're interested in shared universes, why not read all three? Hop on down to the description for links to all three books on Amazon. Enjoy whichever ones you read, and enjoy the video. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni viewer, and it seems a lot of people are talking about Cowboy Bebop recently. In particular, the live-action version that's coming up, and certain controversial choices that were made. And no, I'm not talking about the race swapping. That doesn't really matter all that much to me. In fact, personally, I think anyone who's kind of shocked that they cast a black guy to play Jet Black has clearly only just entered the conversation, because I recall discussions about casting a live-action Cowboy Bebop going years and years back way before I even started my channel. And I remember that was always something that people wanted to see as well. And among my friends, sure, we would go, it's kind of weird so many people want that to be the only option when you look at the character and he's like ashen in complexion, but you know, whatever. Personally, I'm waiting to see how the different actors do in their jobs before I cast any judgment on them. And whether or not they do a good job will have nothing to do with their race, of course. It never really does. No, the controversial thing we'll be addressing today is a costume choice. When those promotional stills were released, a lot of people noticed that Spike's costume and Jet's costume looked about as accurate to the original show as you could get, but Faye's costume was drastically different. And of course, Ayn is a dog, and he doesn't wear anything anyway. He can get away with it. But still, a lot of people zeroed in on Faye's costume because it was drastically changed, and that made it stand out significantly against the other two costumes that were completely accurate. And of course, because of the times we live in, the conversation immediately turned sour, and the people involved in the show didn't help. In particular, Daniela Pineda, the actress who is playing Faye Valentine in the live-action version, made an incredibly flippant response in which she said, you know, they tried looking for an actor who has the impossible proportions of Faye Valentine in the show, but they just couldn't find any. And they tried doing a costume that was show accurate, but it's very impractical to do stunts in tissue paper, and it kept ripping and tearing and riding up, and it was just impractical, guys. We're sorry, we tried. I'm not exaggerating here. You can find her original response. There's no other way to describe it. And of course that prompted more backlash, and now the conversation has just completely devolved to the point where one side is being called a bunch of simps and the other side is being called a bunch of horny misogynistic man-babies. Now, look, I'm coming at this from a different perspective. Like I always do. I have heard plenty of different arguments for and against the new costume, but there's one side I haven't really heard yet, and that is from the perspective of a storyteller. Well, I'm a storyteller. I've got books available on Amazon. If you're interested, please buy them. I'm starving. But I feel like I could possibly bring something else to the table in terms of this discussion. Now, in case you're wondering, yes, I am familiar with Cowboy Bebop. I've seen the show, I've seen the movie, I obviously own both copies on DVD. I think it's a great show. You're not going to find anything different from me on that front. It is expertly made, expertly acted, the music is phenomenal. It is a very good show. Now, I'm not obsessed over it. If you were to ask me what my favorite anime series are that I have to watch over and over again, revisit every year at least once, I mean, I've never made that list, but I don't think Cowboy Bebop would crack my top 5 because I find I need to be in a very particular frame of mind to watch it, especially if I'm going to watch it from the beginning. I can watch the movie on its own every once in a while, but as for the show, I need to be in a particular headspace. I don't know why, that's just the way it is. I haven't really given it much deeper thought than that. So, I'm not a rabid fan of Cowboy Bebop, but I like Cowboy Bebop. I understand what makes Cowboy Bebop work. And I feel like there is more to say about the costumes than just whether or not they are practical and whether or not they can function in live action. Because costumes, when you're talking about visual entertainment, are their own form of storytelling. You've perhaps heard the old saying, clothes make the man? Well, that's definitely true in fiction. You give a character a costume, and that costume has to somehow fit the character. Not in terms of physical measurements, but in terms of that's something the character would wear. And maybe it even tells us something about the character. In fact, you can derive a lot about a character based entirely on the costume. Even if you have nothing else around that character, just looking at what the character is wearing can potentially tell you a lot. Unless, of course, it's just the most plain of street clothes, in which case that's probably a background character who's not meant to be paid attention to. Or maybe that is the point. But seriously, a costume can really tell us a lot. You have a blank piece of paper and you draw a character on it and nothing else, I can derive something from what that character is wearing. Is the character wearing a leather flight jacket and a matching helmet with goggles? That character is probably a pilot, most likely from the 30s, 40s, or 50s, because that's an older style for pilots. Is the character wearing an apron and a tall white hat with a poof on the end? That character is probably a chef, or at the very least, they're cooking and having fun while doing it. Is the character, say, dressed in a fancy suit with tails and has a monocle and a top hat? That's a very fancy character, most likely able to afford a more expensive suit, so probably rich as well. See what I'm getting at? I obviously can't tell everything about the character just from the costume, but I can probably make certain assumptions based on that attire. And unless you decide to troll me and say, actually, they're all just going to a Halloween party, that guess is most likely going to be at least in the right direction, if not completely accurate. And we can apply the same thing to the characters of Cowboy Bebop. Each character of Cowboy Bebop was completely designed from the ground up, and that includes their costumes. And what do their costumes actually say about who they are? Let's start with our main character, Spike Spiegel. What does he wear? He wears a blue blazer with matching dress pants, a yellow button-down shirt, and a necktie. But look at how he's wearing them. The blazer is usually just loosely buttoned. The shirt collar of his yellow shirt is undone quite a bit, and his necktie, by extension, is very loose. His sleeves are rolled up, and the suit honestly looks like it's a little bit wrinkled most of the time. We can even get a little bit into the use of color here, and note that most of his outfit is cool colors, navy blue, but it's covering a bright yellow shirt. So that's a warm color. Cool color over warm color could signify a cool exterior but a fiery interior. So from things like that, I can derive about Spike, just from looking, that he's probably a very laid-back individual, or at least that's how he seems, doesn't really care what people think of him, and he keeps a cool exterior, but inside he's got passion, and it can erupt at any moment. Moving on to Jet Black, his predominant outfit is blue overalls, specifically dingy-looking blue overalls, covering a reddish, pinkish, purplish t-shirt and metal boots. Now, I look at that and I instantly think mechanic, blue-collar guy. At the very least, this guy does a lot of toiling around with machines. He certainly is dressed for it. Overalls are a working man's outfit, after all. And once again, we see something similar to Jet in that it's cool colors over warm colors, except the warm color of that t-shirt isn't 100% warm. Like I said, it's kind of floating somewhere between red, pink, and purple, so it's kind of warm transitioning into cool. So he's still got those emotions, he's still got a passion within him that's usually maintained by a stoic exterior, but it's not quite on the same level as what we see from Spike, whose warm color is a very bright yellow. We move on to the original Faye Valentine. Obviously, she's wearing a costume that shows off a lot of skin. Yellow halter top with matching short shorts. She has a red jacket, but she wears it off her shoulders to ensure that as much of her body is exposed as possible. And she exposes even more of it in how she wears the top and the shorts, undoing a strategic button here and there to make it look like they could potentially fall off at any moment. And of course, the color scheme, she doesn't have any cool colors in her outfit. It's yellow covered by red. Those are all warm colors. That means that there's a greater sense of emotion and passion and fire within her, and she doesn't make any attempts to hide it. And of course, the fact that it reveals so much of her body and accentuates her feminine form, if you will, tells us that she wants people looking at her torso specifically. She wants the eye drawn to her body. That is her desire. And quick aside, we can actually contrast the warm colors of her costume with the fact that her hair is sort of a mix of black and purple, which are cool colors, and the fact that she specifically has cool colors on her head points to the idea that she is actually very level-headed, even though she is physically hot, if you will. But that's getting into hair. We're talking about costumes here. I know she doesn't have an equivalent in the live-action show as yet. I haven't heard any announcements, and she's obviously not in the promo images, but I may as well also look at Edward as well. What does Edward wear? Very tight-fitting dark shorts and a white t-shirt that's way too big for her and falls off of one shoulder. That immediately tells me she's a free spirit. She doesn't wear shoes either. Another sign of a free spirit. Someone who's just sort of la-di-da, everything is wonderful sort of mindset. And the color contrast of white top and black bottom doesn't necessarily mean anything in terms of placement, but the color scheme of black and white is a very simple contrast, which also might speak to how the character sees the world. Maybe this character sees things in terms of black and white, right and wrong, good and bad. No area where there might be gray, and if there is gray, she might not even understand it. So that's what we can derive from the characters as they were designed in the original show. And being illustrations, they were all intentionally designed to look that way. Whether or not they came out of the gate like that, I highly doubt it, but nevertheless, that's where they wound up. And that is what you can derive just by looking at them. And does any of that stuff play out in the show? Yes, it does. You watch Cowboy Bebop, Spike usually acts very laid back, acts like he doesn't care, but he does. And he has a lot going on underneath that he tries to keep covered up. But somehow that emotion and empathy always finds its way to the surface despite his best efforts. Also, the cool exterior hides the fact that he actually knows martial arts and can kick your butt if you cross him. Jet is indeed a more blue-collar kind of character. He's far more level-headed, not quite as passionate as Spike, but still does have that empathy, he still does have that emotion, and yeah, he does a lot of mechanical stuff, particularly when it comes to keeping the ship running. Faye's outfit is very much meant to draw your eye to her body, because that way you won't see what she's doing with her hands, which is most likely stealing something from you. She is very confident, she knows how she looks, and she uses those looks to her advantage. And she's really smart in how she's able to do it. She usually gets the drop on other characters very easily at times. And Ed, of course, certainly is a free spirit with a very simple outlook. Because, you know, she is a child, technically. 13, but still a very immature 13 when you get right down to it. So her outfit reflects her personality as well. Again, we have no idea what's going to happen with Edward, if Edward is even going to be in the live-action adaptation, but I just wanted to cover all my bases. So I hope that is sufficient evidence to support my thesis, that a character's costume is linked to a character's personality, that a costume itself can be a form of visual storytelling. some way of informing us about some aspect of a fictional character. And if you have a character that's got an iconic look and you change it somehow, that's implying that you might also be changing something fundamental about the character. Now, something I've also seen pop up in this conversation is the idea of superhero movies, and how the vast majority of superhero movies at this point haven't really adapted the comic book costumes directly to film. They usually make some sort of really big change. One example I saw is for Captain America, where the outfit in the first Avengers, certainly, and every subsequent version, has had a more practical look to it, more like a soldier's uniform, with pouches, a belt, and a proper helmet, things like that. Now, of course, that ignores the fact that in Captain America the First Avenger, we actually did get a costume that was pretty much a one-to-one translation of what we saw in the books. But here's the thing about that. Yes, they changed the costume while maintaining certain recognizable features, but the changes they made still played into the character. In the movies, Cap is a soldier, just like in the comics. A soldier wears a uniform. A soldier needs to have equipment and extra ammo and stuff on him if he wants to make it out of the battle. So giving him proper military fatigues that just happen to be painted like a superhero costume, that actually is a change that makes sense. It doesn't feel like it's completely altering the character. This costume change for Faye Valentine, though, feels like it is a big change. It is very different from what we saw before. It's got some recognizable elements, like the yellow top with the red jacket, but now the yellow top is much bigger and far more closed up, not zipped up all the way, but more so as to cover her body. The jacket is worn over her shoulders like a jacket is usually worn, as opposed to slung down. And the shorts, technically they're still there, but there's no definition made between them and her stockings, and all of that area is now dark. The main color of this costume is black, and the colors of the recognizable parts are even darker. The red is darker, the yellow isn't as vibrant, and a lot more of her body is covered. You put the two costumes side by side, you might not guess that they are the same character. Or you might guess that if they are the same character, maybe they're not the same take on the character. That the live action version is drastically different in terms of personality from the original version. Now, what those changes might be, I don't know. We only have the stills to go on. We can't really derive much about the show's content based just on a handful of static images. But if I had to derive something about this character based solely on those images, like I did before, I'd have to say this is clearly not a character who wants people looking at her body for any reason. She's covering herself up. She doesn't want to be objectified, even if objectifying her somehow works into her plan. And the fact that the majority of her costume is dark now, rather than composed of brighter colors, also speaks to a major change. And it's not like it's dark colors over light colors like what the other male characters have. This is just a majority of a costume that's dark. So it seems to me like that points to the idea that she's maybe a bit more pulled back in terms of personality. So that's implying some pretty drastic changes to the character, to the point where I have to ask, is it going to be the same character? Now, yes, quite a few people are looking at this change and immediately assuming that this is going to be yet another example of Hollywood claiming to be feminist by redesigning a popular female character and desexualizing her, but only stopping at the desexualization and not doing anything to actually make the character interesting, even though the character was interesting already, and thus it's going to completely ruin Cowboy Bebop. Now at this point, nobody has proof that that's the case, but given how often that actually has happened in other works over the last few years, I don't think you can really blame anyone for jumping to that conclusion right now. And in terms of practicality of the costume, setting aside Daniela Pineda's flippant response, she says they tried the costume. They tried a show accurate costume, and it was impractical to do stunts in and perform in. Now that statement implies that she does her own stunts, which if that's the case, kudos to her. Based on what I recall of the show, I don't know what kind of stunts she'd be doing as Faye Valentine, which speaks to even greater changes to the character, but again, set that aside for now. She says they tried the costume. Where's the footage? That's what I want to know. If they really did test a more anime-accurate costume for this live-action adaptation, there is no way they did not get footage of it, because that's part of the process. You do the test footage to see how it looks on film. If Netflix releases that footage showing us that the costume really doesn't work in execution, the debate is over. They will have demonstrated that the costume really was impractical and they had to change it. If the footage exists, if they actually tried it. At this point, I don't think anyone has any reason to think that they did. If the costume, as in its original state, ever was part of the conversation, it probably never made it past concept art. But without footage to support the claim, I remain skeptical. So that's where I stand on the matter. I'm not a rabid fan of Cowboy Bebop, I'm not a contrarian detractor of Cowboy Bebop, I'm not a creepy otaku who's upset that my anime waifu is being covered up by evil Hollywood executives. I'm just looking at this from the perspective of a storyteller who usually likes to design his characters in addition to writing about them. And as someone who does that, I feel there's more to these costumes than first meets the eye. And to say that the original costume exists solely to sexualize the character and provide creepy otaku with something to do in their private time, that is not only an insult to the fan base, that's an insult to the crew of Cowboy Bebop, who put a lot of time and effort into making these characters and making sure their looks actually fit and did something important to inform us about them and tell the story. But then again, I guess it's ultimately up to you to decide whether or not anything I said makes sense. I can only tell you that I have my own perspective, and based on that, I do have my concerns. But we'll see what happens when the first trailer actually drops. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni viewer saying 3, 2, 1, let's jam. If you enjoyed what you just saw, hop on down to the description for links to Patreon, DeviantArt, and all of our social media, as well as links for Operation Red Dragon, The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, The Occult Mafia, and Emerald of Maddox City, 3 original novels I think you'll really enjoy. Thank you all, and we appreciate your support.